I'm going to be talking to Evan Pivnick, who is the Clean Energy Program Manager with Clean Energy Canada, about a study they have released recently comparing electricity generation costs in Canada. So welcome to the interview, Evan.
Thanks for having me.
Now, you've done levelized cost of energy estimates for wind, solar, and batteries. And that basically takes all of the costs associated with constructing and operating those energy generation sources. You amortize it out over the life of the project, whether it be 25 years, whatever it is. And then you come up with a cost per kilowatt hour or megawatt hour. So give us kind of an overview of the study, if you wouldn't mind.
Yeah, what we did, we take a look at what existed out there for Canada and found that most of the big studies that have looked at net zero or other technologies have really been relying on the big US studies. And we wanted to take a look at what is it actually costing to generate electricity from renewable sources in Canada, and took Alberta and Ontario as our first provinces. So looking at those three technologies that you mentioned, we built out the local cost, got a sense of what it actually is taking to produce electricity from a cost perspective in each place, and found that in Alberta, wind and solar are already cheaper than natural gas. And in Ontario, you can see wind is already producing cheaper electricity and solar is just a few years away. Long term, though, all of these technologies see massive declines, up to 40% up to 2035.
Now, one of the knocks against wind and solar, and this isn't true, but it gets to be a complex, how utilities and system operators manage the intermittent renewables gets to be a complicated question. I mean, there's demand responses and markets involved and all that sort of thing. But putting in battery storage or any kind of storage, could be compressed air, could be pumped hydro, could be something else. But that changes the equation, doesn't it?
It really does. And it was a big reason why we wanted to look at batteries as well. The technologies we chose are ones that we're already seeing widespread deployment globally. So a lot of different storage technologies are at various stages of development, whereas batteries are on grids. They're providing backups for renewables in a number of different countries already. So we wanted to take a look and found that in many cases, pairing renewables with batteries in these two jurisdictions, in Alberta and Ontario, was already cost competitive with gas peakers. So the ability to move load, several hours from when it's generated helps a wind resource serve a much greater degree of services. And it's a legitimate concern for utilities that need to make sure that as energy demand peaks, that they can ramp up the resources. Batteries and other storage technology just helps renewables play that role as well.
Right, and that's a really good point, because what I assume that the battery storage you're talking about is lithium ion, which is the most common right now at utility scale. But we're seeing a number of other types of batteries, like flow batteries. Zinc ion is getting set to enter the market, iron ion. There's all kinds of different chemistries out there that offer different features. For instance, instead of 4 or 8 hour durations of storage, which is what your study used, some of them now are at 12 or 16 hours. So all of that, what you've done is capture a moment in time, but the situation in a year or 2 or 5 will be dramatically different.
And that's exactly why these sorts of cost assessments are so important, because if the data you're using to inform your net zero studies is out of date, or if you're using cost data, even from just a few years ago when it comes to renewables, you have not captured how quickly and how vastly the actual cost of these resources has declined. So this, as much as this is I think a really important contribution in the conversation today, ideally this sort of Canadian specific, jurisdiction specific cost information is something that's updated every year or two to ensure that we're tracking all of those cost declines and frankly expanding the technologies we're looking at. Batteries are going to be a great solution where we need to move power between hours, or as you say, perhaps a day. But there's going to be other technologies. It's, green hydrogen, it's pumped air, hydro, the abilities of these to meet those longer durations where it's, need to move load over the course of several days. Understanding the costs and the cost declines that technologies are seeing is just essential to make good decisions.
Now, let's talk about Ontario first, because Ontario has got a big problem. It did a really good job of getting coal out of its electricity system. Then there was the big controversy over wind and solar. when the Ford government came in, but now they're looking at because some of the nuclear plants are going offline, they're looking at bringing on a lot more gas, which has raised concerns over hitting climate targets. And wind and solar really weren't being considered as part of the conversation. But given the numbers that are in your study, it sounds like they really should.
Yeah, I think so. What Ontario is going through right now is a process to add 4 gigawatts of capacity to, as you say, make up for nuclear towards the end of the decade. To their credit, 2.5 of those gigawatts, 2.5 of those 4 are looking at things like batteries and other forms of energy storage. And I think that is incredible, and it's going to be a incredibly important not experiment, but it's going to drive so much innovation in Canada to see these projects on the ground. But the other 1.5 gigawatts is looking to come from natural gas and peaker plants. So our work doesn't necessarily say you shouldn't build that, you should build this instead. But it does lead to asking the question, can the capacity needs of the grid that this 1.5 gigawatts of natural gas is being built to address, can they be met through other means? Can we cost effectively deploy renewables alongside storage solutions, perhaps supported by imports as necessary to cost effectively meet those needs without building out additional emitting technology like natural gas, which we know it's only going to face higher costs in the future?
Well, that's right. I mean, the federal government is bringing in a clean electricity standard. The carbon price is going up. I mean, there will be all sorts of pressure on the price of electricity generated by gas. Whereas once you've invested, you paid the capital cost of solar and wind, essentially your costs have remained low as long as those technologies are generating power.
You're exactly right. And frankly, that's why renewables globally have taken off. Cost is a big factor. And that cost decline has led to widespread deployment. But even before, the Russian invasion of Ukraine, we were already seeing the energy security side of renewables being raised. The cost fluctuations that fossil fuels see expose ratepayers to all sorts of increases and falls. If we're able to separate ourselves from that, generate the electricity we need locally using local resources, we're able to enhance the energy security of Ontarians and Canadians writ large there. So that same trend we're seeing globally, it needs to become a bigger part of the conversation in Canada.
There's another angle to this because last year, I can't remember which region of Southern Ontario it was, but they lost a $1.5 billion battery project because the company wanted to build it there, but they couldn't guarantee them enough clean electricity. And I interview all sorts of startups and other companies that are looking to establish different types of clean energy technology plants. And the number one item on their list when they're looking to site is access to reasonably cost, reliable, clean electricity. So if regions want to, for instance, if you're in Windsor or London, someplace like that, and you say, look, we want to attract battery plants. We want to attract the supply chain for the electric vehicle industry, but we need clean electricity. You can actually build your own supply. Right? It becomes a competitive advantage for your local industrial base.
I actually think this is one of the big turning points of the past several years that we're seeing is no longer are renewables and other sort of clean technologies simply being caught up in a conversation around climate change and how we need to address this. This is now about economic competitiveness. This is about our ability to secure new investments, new supply chains, and see opportunities growing in different parts of the country. So the economic competitiveness, and you're right, battery supply chain is a great example where we've seen repeated examples cited of the availability of Canadian cheap, reliable, but increasingly clean electricity as one of the fundamental decision points that companies are making about whether they're going to locate their facilities here. And I think that's really starting to land with governments. That's where they're starting to put in place policies, not because they're necessarily aligned on climate change or sort of trying to advance on that objective alone, but because industry's coming to them and saying, we can't build here. We don't think that you've got a plan to ensure that you're going to be able to transmit enough power for our growing interests in this province or in this region. So I think that has really changed the conversation as well.
Yeah, I can see where that happened in Ontario because there's so much. I mean, there's like 700 auto parts suppliers, in the province, and all of them are switching over to serve the EV market now. So lots of flux, and that would be, so clean electricity is a big issue. But what about Alberta? Because Alberta adds more wind and solar every year than any other province by like a considerable margin. So how does this play out in Alberta?
Yeah, Alberta is a different case and for different reasons, but I think it also has some really important lessons for other jurisdictions, other provinces that want to accelerate it. Alberta changed the economics of their market. They've got an open market. They don't have that sort of monopoly that you see in a lot of other provinces where it's it's a crown-owned utility that is building all of the generation. They actually have a market that lets different companies come in and compete for who can provide cheaper electricity. So in restructuring how their market works, they were able to see huge amounts of entrance of solar and wind, in part because different companies were paying to see that built for their own ESG reporting. And so this confluence of different factors has come together that's seen Alberta, at least in sort of the short and medium term, as the real juggernaut of wind and solar energy deployment in Canada. And it's certainly from our study, like having countless examples of actual projects being built and supplying it gave us huge insight into what the actual costs are to produce electricity in Alberta, and being able to share those insights about how it's able to move forward. It's a huge opportunity, and it's untapped still to a certain extent. The starting point is there, but additional calls for power, structuring the market to really decarbonize Alberta. I think alongside the renewable deployment is actually the other side, which is there's also a lot of natural gas being built to replace the coal that is fading out of Alberta. So Alberta is really the story of two extremes here, and we, trying to weave those back together, I think, is part of the objective.
Now, in 2018, Alberta caused a big ripple in the sort of renewable energy circles because they had an auction, and the successful bidder supplied wind energy at 3.8 cents a kilowatt hour, which was just very low. We're 5 years later now. Where are we at are we in the same ballpark, or have costs fallen?
Yeah, I mean, costs overall have continued to fall. It's really important to not take, our work looks at the average for a project across the cost factors that can be built into an LCOE. Individual projects will have all sorts of different characteristics. So when we look at wind resources, certain sites just offer better potential for wind. They're able to therefore generate more electricity more efficiently, and they're going to see even lower costs. So our work and this cost study with Dunsky tracks that sort of average that you'd expect in Alberta. And the long-term trend on that is down. You're continuing to see costs fall for a variety of reasons. Wind turbine blades are getting more effective. The facilities are getting bigger and able to then generate from, lower class wind resources. Similar story when it comes to solar.
Now, what about combined cycle gas turbines? That's predominantly the forecasts I've seen for 2030 are that Alberta will be 70% gas and 30% renewables. So that's a lot of gas, and most of it will be this CCGT. How does CCGT line up against wind solar paired with storage?
Yeah, in terms of the actual cost of the resources, our work suggests that wind and solar in many cases will, in Alberta in particular, will already be cheaper than what combined cycle gas can generate. That is the starting point, though. The full question is that sort of needs of the grid. So what amount of power is needed with what sort of dependability and its ability to be deployed? So can you overbuild renewables, pair it with storage to ensure that all the same energy needs can be met? Potentially. That's really where we see the next step of work needing to start to ask those questions. But in order to do that, you have to have really good information around the costs of these things. And that's where our work really feeds in. So I see it more as a precursor to that conversation. The other piece I'd say is there's a big difference between stuff that already exists today and how we're going to address that versus what we build going forward. And I think to the greatest extent possible, we need to be trying to minimize any new build out of natural gas, whether it's peakers or it's combined cycle. We need to be trying to find other options that doesn't put new emitting assets. There's a huge risk that these become stranded assets, that they lead to increased costs for Canadians with the power. We should be trying to see if we can address those same needs through other means. The answer might not universally be yes on every single instance and every single need, but it's far more than we're seeing today. And we need to start asking those questions a bit more deliberately.
I'm headed off to Edmonton next week to interview. There's a hydrogen summit on Tuesday, and I'll be interviewing a lot of companies that are either looking at supplying hydrogen or they make technology, like fuel cells that consume hydrogen. And one of the questions I'm going to ask is, when you're citing industry, like let's say you look at the Edmonton Regional Hydrogen Hub. They want to have literally an industrial cluster of hydrogen related businesses. Now, for something like that, does it make sense to site wind and solar nearby that hub, to lower your electricity costs, pair it with storage so that you've got reliability and dispatchability? And
Yeah.
it seems to me that as these industrial clusters, we get more of them because they're coming, according to the experts, that siting the wind and solar right next to them makes a lot of sense, at least to uninformed journalists.
Yeah, so I think there's a couple things going on there. I think in general, siting your generation near to where your actual load or where the demand is going to be generally is a really important piece. When we look at wind and solar, we're going to need to take things into account like how the wind seasonally blows. So if you get really good quality resource in the summer, but it falls off in the winter, that won't be sufficient on its own. And you're going to need to then think about how you're building out batteries or you're building out other forms of storage that can help move it around, or connecting the province more broadly with transmission lines where wind in the north, when it isn't blowing, you do see wind in the south, and we can then leverage that resource. So I think that's one component. With hydrogen in particular, the relationship between hydrogen and renewable energy, I think, is we're just at the starting point here. There's a great study that came out of the US that saw if we tried to maximize, if renewable energy was maximized, the number one technology solution that emerged to support it from a storage perspective was green hydrogen. So there is going to be a relationship where hydrogen and renewables can really be complementary in enhancing each other. So renewables providing the electricity to run electrolysis to generate hydrogen, which can be used as its own fuel, or could be stored and then turned back into energy to support areas or times when renewables aren't producing as much electricity. That's a relationship that I think we're going to continue to see only grow. And I think what Edmonton is doing is really at the cutting edge of, on the hydrogen side, what we're seeing.
Yeah, it's so interesting. There are so many new clean energy technologies that are coming on stream now that really forecasting out 2 to 5 years down the road, never mind 10 or 20, is very difficult. It's difficult because how they fall in costs, how ways in which they can be combined in these clusters or to supply clusters. All of that needs to be explored and experimented with and piloted, and to find the optimal use case for them. And I think we're going to see a lot more of that. But the takeaway from your study and from the observations we've made during this interview is that it's all becoming economic. It's all becoming feasible and technically feasible and economically feasible. And I suspect we're going to see a lot more of that in the coming years.
You're absolutely right. I think our work points to an increasingly cost competitive, or in many cases, cheaper resource. In the report we put out alongside the sort of broader data set highlighting all of the additional benefits we're seeing, there is good reason for Canadian jurisdictions right across the country to be exploring how they can maximize the role of renewables on their grids. It won't be the answer for absolutely every question we have and every need we have for the energy system, but there is incredible room to grow, and we need to be investing. We need to be creating areas of policy certainty so that investors know where we're going. We need to be removing barriers for battery and storage technologies, and we need to be enhancing our jurisdiction-specific research. Ontario has different pathways ahead of it than Alberta, and you're right, we don't know for certain what will be the correct pathway, but we can start to chart what are the 2 to 3 likely ones, and then as we start to move through time and see which one we're on, start to maximize the opportunities from that pathway. Jurisdiction-specific research, good data, that's what will lead to good decisions.
Well, and we hope that'll be the case. Thank you very much for this, Evan. Really appreciate it.
Thanks so much for having me.